relationship between consciousness and materialism. Materialism is the belief that the only real things are physical. Whatever is not physical is not real. Consciousness is sentient awareness, what it feels like inside, the inner sense of experience. I'm fixated on whether materialism can explain consciousness. I did a doctorate in brain research, hoping it would help. How could a 3-pound ball of flesh produce experience? How could physical stuff be about things? Mental stuff seems so utterly different from physical stuff. I don't want to fool myself, conjure up ghosts and machines, make up entities that don't exist. Consciousness exists, that's for sure, but how can it work? Is materialism sufficient to explain how consciousness works? If not, could there be more to materialism than the known laws of physics? Can an enlarged materialism explain consciousness? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. In a universe of physical things, consciousness stands apart. Consciousness is the oddball, a different category. There's nothing else like it. We know that consciousness depends on the brain. The big question is whether consciousness is caused entirely by the brain. If not, then wouldn't consciousness overthrow materialism? Consciousness certainly seems to have the potential of undermining materialism, but because materialism is the basis for science, I'd worry if its foundations start to shake. That's why I begin with philosopher Colin McGinn, who appreciates both the strength of materialism and the mystery of consciousness. Colin, due to the extraordinary complexity or mystery of consciousness, some have used consciousness as a way of undermining materialism for perhaps legitimate reasons, or perhaps because they have an agenda, often theological. Yeah. How do you view consciousness being used by some to undermine materialism?
I think it's legitimate to undermine materialism in what I would call a narrow sense of materialism. That is, the idea that our current knowledge of the brain is sufficient to explain everything about the mind. If that's what we mean by materialism, then that's undermined by consciousness. However, if it's understood as, does it undermine materialism in a broader sense? Then the question is, well, what is that broader sense of materialism? Now, the point I would make is that matter itself has undermined materialism in the classical understanding of materialism, because materialism was closely tied to mechanism, and mechanism has been refuted by physics time and time again. So just as electromagnetism refuted materialism as it was understood in Descartes' time, consciousness also refutes it. So there must be some other sense of materialism which is being questioned by consciousness. The difficulty is always, if you interpret materialism in a narrow sense and tie it to our current knowledge, it seems empirically false. If you widen it to include anything that might be discovered by the sciences, then it just seems empty, because
trivially true.
Trivially true. So what we have now really is a problem of integration. We can't integrate the knowledge we have that there are conscious events, conscious states, with the knowledge we have of the physical world as we now understand it. There seems to be a discontinuity between the physical world as we now understand it and the existence of consciousness.
Such a large percentage of neuroscientists don't think there's a problem here. They claim that the current trajectory is sufficient with neuronal electricity and systems and very complicated forms, but as they go on their current trajectory, they will be able to explain fully consciousness.
I think because they interpret the word consciousness in a different way from the way you and I, and most people interpret it. They always mean by consciousness the functions that are performed by a conscious being. So they'll talk about the function of discriminating between one thing and another. And that's their version of what it is to perceive something, to see something. And they'll say, well, look, here's an organism. it can discriminate between this class of objects and these other class of objects, let's say red and green object. And when we look into their brain, we can see how the neurons enable them to make that distinction, that discrimination, because look, these are active when the red objects are there, those are active when the green objects are there. We see how those receptor neurons are connected to the motor neurons, which enable the organism to behave in selective ways. Right. And so doesn't neurophysiology explain completely all of that? The answer is yes, it does explain that. But that's not what we mean by consciousness. Consciousness is not just the behavioral association of a conscious state. It is the conscious state itself. But for some reason, neuroscientists, like some psychologists before them, think of everything from a third-person point of view. So they think of describing an organism from the outside and what it does. And they say, well, we can explain all of that in terms of the brain. That may well be true. They forget to think of consciousness as they experience it from a first-person point of view, as everybody experiences it from a first-person point of view. And that's where the problem really is at its most vivid. It's not as if, really, on a good analysis, it would be right to say you can explain it from a third-person point of view, but not from a first-person point of view. Because after all, what you attribute to another organism, when you say this organism is seeing something red, it's the same kind of thing that you experience in yourself when you say, I'm seeing something red. So those other organisms have those mental states. It's just that the neuroscientists tend to look only at the behavioral manifestations of the mental state, not the mental state itself. And they think they can explain the behavioral manifestations.
How do you look upon the likelihood or the possibility of creating non-biological intelligence that has consciousness?
Yeah. If you think of consciousness as a set of behavioral dispositions or a set of capacities to cope with the environment, then you'll say, why couldn't I make a machine with behavioral dispositions like our bodies have? Well, maybe the answer is that wouldn't be in principle very difficult. But that is not the same thing as creating a machine which has the conscious states which underlie those dispositions. So it simply doesn't follow from the fact that you've duplicated the outside of consciousness, that is, say, what it causes, that you've duplicated the inside.
Colin argues that the human brain may be incapable of comprehending consciousness, and that consciousness does undermine materialism as it stands today. But that's a narrow materialism. So, could an enlarged materialism account for consciousness? What could an enlarged materialism be like? Some claim that ESP and the paranormal provide clues. Those skeptical, I go to San Francisco, to the Institute of Noetic Sciences, to ask Chief Scientist Dean Radin.
Dean, there is great tension between the concept of consciousness and the prevailing view of materialism, and it comes from both sides. Scientists who are very materialistic would seek to reduce consciousness to purely the output of the physical brain. If those people who really believe deeply that consciousness is something special would see it as an ultimate defeater for the philosophy of materialism.
It revolves around what we think we mean by material. What is material? I like material. Like ice cream is a good material. But what is it? If you go deeply into ice cream, it turns into energy, and then it turns into relationships, and sort of disappears the further down you go. Well, so what was it that I was liking? It's nothing. It's like mostly empty stuff. So now we have people who believe in spirits and other places that are somewhere else. And typically what I find is that the idea of defeating materialism is brought about by people who really don't like the idea of matter. Maybe they don't like ice cream, but I do. So I don't necessarily want to make it go away. It's useful for stuff. And so I imagine that in essence we're dealing with a spectrum of reality. I don't see a strong incompatibility between ideas, spiritual type ideas, and material. And it's because you just look through history about the nature of matter. How has it changed historically? Well, it is becoming more and more ephemeral. And I imagine it will continue to become more ephemeral.
So your view is, in essence, that there is one kind of thing that's material, but it is much richer and deeper and more complicated than maybe some would believe today. And therefore, as it becomes enlarged, that one thing will encompass all of the things that are necessary to explain consciousness.
Yes, but it may not explain gods and angels and demons. Maybe it'll explain things that are sort of at the edge that seem to have something to do with information or energy. But I can still see it as a form of material, just that we expand our notion of what we meant by that term.
So you would then say that consciousness helps expand our sense of the material world.
Yeah, in fact, consciousness could also be seen as a type of material. It's a substance. I mean, we don't use the word mind stuff without thinking that it's a kind of a stuff.
So how do we do that? How do you get mind stuff that is a real stuff in some way that is not dualistic?
Well, if you imagine that matter in a more refined state is energy, and energy in a more refined state is consciousness.
So what you have to do then, if you want to be a monist, only one kind of thing, and you want that monism to be materialist, it has to dramatically expand materialism so that at its core, or its most fundamental level, it's consciousness.
Is that so radical?
Well, yeah, I'd say it's certainly against the traditional worldview of science today.
Perhaps.
Maybe we move in different circles here.
Yeah, I don't know. In my circles, it's basically a panpsychist view, which I find to be the one that makes the most sense to me.
Panpsychic meaning that consciousness is in everything in some proto form or something.
Right. And the emergent properties from consciousness gives rise to energy and matter, essentially.
Okay, well that's...
I know it's a little bit different than what is ordinarily thought of as panpsychism.
Right.
I'm actually imagining that it is a substrate, a kind of a substance from which other things emerge, and we call those energy and matter.
Now that is not classical idealism. Classical idealism says that at its basis everything is consciousness and matter is the illusion.
Right.
And that's not what you're saying.
No.
You're saying matter is real.
Right. It's all real. It's just it's different levels of refinement of reality. And it's partially because I have a physical science background, so I find it easier to imagine it's all really one substance. And I don't generally go towards dualistic arguments because why stop there? Maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe 10. That's why.
So one is simpler.
One is simpler.
Dean is not a dualist. Consciousness is not separate from the physical world. Rather, he founds the physical world on consciousness. The matter and energy of traditional materialism, he claims, emerges somehow from consciousness. Dean subscribes to a radical panpsychism. Consciousness is the underlying essence of all those particles. This hardly sounds like materialism, so what is it? Well, it's not idealism, where only the mind is real, because the physical world is real. And it's not a religiously motivated dualism with need for immortal souls. There's no normal name for this kind of reality. So because the material world is really real, but with consciousness features not part of current physics, could this be an enlarged materialism? But how could an enlarged materialism work? The importance of consciousness in the physical world infuses some Eastern wisdom traditions. If an enlarged materialism can explain consciousness, can Eastern ideas help? I ask Anirban Bandyopadhyay, a material scientist who explores brain models.
Personally, I think that if we consider just materialistic view, it will be erroneous. And if I think that something else sitting out there and that is the consciousness and then somehow we are going it, that's also wrong. So I cannot support either of the views. So I support something different, and I suggest that the matter and the energy, they come together and they dance together. They create the harmony or the rhythm. So just if energy was alone in the universe, there could not have been consciousness. If the matter was alone in the universe, there could not have been consciousness. Because they came together, they started dancing together. That's why consciousness was born.
So what you're suggesting is that there is a deeper reality than what we are fiddling with in our traditional science. Is that right?
There is a religious belief, kind of a strong suggestion from the materialistic scientist that the consciousness must emerge from the material itself.
Right.
We don't need anything else. And then those people who are the other way around, they say that there is energy that was existing all along the universe, and we are just a part of it. Sometimes we need to reject both of them and come up with something new. That's why I do not say that matter-energy duality. I say symmetry and vibration of symmetry.
And this is a universal quality that pervades everything.
Everything. If you ask any physicist, okay, I want to replace with symmetry every single matter, they will not. Because you go to the elementary particle physicist, and you go to the person who are working on molecular scale in the DNA level, biologist, wherever you go, nobody opposes the symmetry concept. So that's why I think that's a good line to begin with and to replace everything.
But in that process, there's nothing special about consciousness because you have the same analysis for everything.
Yeah. So every single thing is analyzed in a similar way. That doesn't mean that nothing is special.
So how then is consciousness special or is it not special?
Both together, because it is special because a certain set of elements come together and mirrors the entire vibration and try to replicate and try to harmonize with the universal chain of vibrations that is connecting Planck world to the ultimate form of universe, vibrational chain. So those elements could be you and me. A human being is a string of vibration and trying to harmonize. Isn't it special? So that string is, of course, special. So it is special in the sense that it is trying to mirror or harmonize with the entire vibrational chain of the entire universe. So that's why it's special, but it is not so special.
To Anirban, vibrations and harmonies in the cosmos are the essence of an exotic materialism. It's an ancient idea about the deep structure of reality. But to construct the whole edifice of existence on vibrations is not taken seriously by modern science. Still, if materialism is to explain consciousness, it will likely need to be enlarged. To explore how Eastern traditions might integrate with Western science, perhaps to make an exotic materialism, I speak with a brain scientist at Sony, Ken Mogi.
Maybe we have a too narrow view of what materials are. We have theories for them, classical mechanics, quantum mechanics. We can understand how we can make transistors. We can understand how they behave. But we really don't know what these materials are. So the very fact that the brain, which is an instance of a material, produces consciousness is a testimony that materials are capable of great many things than we traditionally thought of.
Okay, so if that's true, just give me in principle one or two possible ways in which a materialistic brain can generate consciousness.
You know, people talk about superconductivity and, superfluidity. If you have a very special condition of material, they behave in a totally unexpected way.
Right, okay.
I suspect that consciousness is one of these things that, in which materials behave in a totally unexpected way. If you observe biological systems like you and me, one of the things that strike you is that they are autonomous. They make their own destiny. They decide what they want to do, and they do it. If you look at the natural world, no other systems behave like that. So if you ask, how can you make a very complex system of material be autonomous to that extent, then you are actually talking about how you can produce consciousness. Because consciousness, from evolutionary point of view, is all about this autonomicity. How you can choose your own action.
Okay, you may have a correlation between autonomy and consciousness, but they are radically different, we say, ontological stuff. Autonomy defines a method of living way, self-controlled. Consciousness is a phenomenal experience that we have. They're very different kinds of things.
They are, aren't they? So I suspect this very wonderful subjective phenomenal experience is a bonus that we get from the history of evolution.
So you believe consciousness is something that came along for the ride. A bonus means it didn't have to be there.
Well, from evolution point of view, in terms of adaptation, it makes sense to be autonomous, but it doesn't
Yes.
make sense to have this phenomenal experience.
Right. I agree with that. I agree
So,
with that.
from this perspective, consciousness appears to be a bonus.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And that to me doesn't make sense. It's
Yeah.
so powerful and so special, it seems,
Yeah.
that to have that be a bonus, I mean, it just doesn't feel right. And maybe you're right, but it just
so-
doesn't feel right.
Yeah, exactly. So probably the way materials exist in this universe is such that if you want to behave in an autonomous manner, then there should be this bonus, which is
Yeah.
phenomenal consciousness.
So I like should be better than bonus because should be implies there's some necessity. But here's my fundamental question. If it's a neuronal model, if it's an event-driven model, it's at the end of the day always what's called an identity theory. You have to say that something in the physical world is, equal sign, fully equal to consciousness.
Yeah.
It's an identity.
Yeah.
And it seems inconceivable that something in the physical world can literally be. Like we have pain in my foot, I step on a nail, and I have C fibers, electrical activities running up, and that causes the pain. But to say those fibers, those electrical activities in that fiber is the pain, or at any stage in my brain, they just don't seem the same category at all.
I see what you mean. And I also suspect that there might have been some psychological reasons why we regard materials as something lifeless, something without consciousness, because we use them as tools, right? For example, if you use a hammer, it doesn't help for you to feel that this hammer is conscious, so every time I bang it, it feels pain. So, the same can be said about the Christian tradition of regarding all living forms, apart from the humans, as something that can be used by humans. So I suspect that there might be some historical reasons and psychological reasons why we have traditionally regarded materials as devoid of consciousness.
So your view to maintain your physicalist material worldview
Yeah.
is that our understanding of what is physical and what is material needs to expand and may need to expand
I
dramatically.
believe so.
Right. And so I may come along with you then and agree, but I'm saying that now your definition of physical is anything that's real. So that's cheating a little bit.
Robert, as you know, in contemporary physics, people don't really know what is real and what is unreal. So it's fair that you criticize physicists or materialists that we are narrowing the starting point too strictly, but on the other hand, we do have this new idea of what materials are. So within that space, maybe we can find a compromise between, dualistic view, for example, and materialistic view.
Personally, I hate compromise. What I like is the truth. I don't care where it is. Maybe the truth, maybe you're right. Maybe the brain fully is materialistic and it produces consciousness. I'm not trying to get in there some
Yeah, sure.
compromise. I just want the truth.
But what if there was truth only in compromises? What if?
I would accept the compromise if it's truth, but I won't use compromise as an excuse for coming to an opinion about the truth too quickly.
I see. Maybe this is going too far, but I'll say it anyway. In Western tradition, no matter what the religion was, like a Christian or Jewish or Muslims, always the assumption was there was one God, right? On the other hand, in the Eastern tradition, especially in Japan, there are, literally millions of gods, different gods. So I think probably the Eastern tradition of incorporating all these different principles into one harmony, into one compromise, might serve some service to solve this dilemma.
While many brain scientists believe that materialism is progressing steadily toward explaining consciousness, many philosophers and some scientists disagree. But even among those who doubt that today's materialism can explain consciousness, most still affirm some kind of materialism. They remain committed to a reality that is entirely physical. But they recognize that the nature of materialism must enlarge.
There's the material universe.
What are the candidates for an enlarged materialism? A new kind of monism, one substance underlying both matter and consciousness. Vibrations and harmonies resonating in the cosmos. Quantum mechanics and the changing essence of what is material. Everything seems to disappear in clouds of fields and waves. But no matter what the supposed mechanism, how could it be that our inner awareness is literally anything physical? What makes consciousness so special? I'm not convinced that an enlarged materialism is closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.